John Ljungkvist lehrt und forscht seit Jahrzehnten an der Universität Uppsala und sein Name ist vor allen Dingen verbunden mit zahlreichen Publikationen zu den Grabhügeln und der Siedlung von Alt-Uppsala und seiner Funktion und Entwicklung als politischer Zentralort. Sein allgemeines Interesse richtet sich auf die kulturellen Verbindungen der Wikingerzeit in Skandinavien, dem Baltikum und den britischen Inseln. Und er wird uns heute diese Verbindung anhand von Panzerteilen oder Bewaffnungsteilen eher, muss ich sagen, aufzeigen. Bitte.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction and for the invitation to this presentation. The key object for this presentation is the Valsgärde splint armor. But I like to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the body armor in general that we have in Sweden, or at least in Middle Sweden, and the history of the body armor. It's much about, more or less about helmets, and the earliest body armor we have is a probable find from the grave from period C3 outside Uppsala. It's a very vague indication. In the migration period, we have at least one certain Spangenhelm and from Gotland, a vague helmet from the west coast of Sweden. But when we reach into the Vendel period, which means after 560, 70 AD, we see kind of an explosion of armor in the archaeological records, and that is primarily of helmets. And there has been a couple of studies, no very recent one, by scholars of the helmets. They're primarily found in boat graves, but there are also a couple of finds from rich cremation burials. And there are also a few unpublished finds from recent years, but so the full record of helmet finds have not been published. When we talk about body armor, all body armor I know from Sweden are found in Uppland. And on this picture, can imagine on this southern lowermost edge of the map, that's where we have Stockholm. And the map shows the coastline around 500 AD. And we have body armors from 4 locations that we know of in Uppland. The northernmost site is Vendel, where Vendel 10 contains probably a full chainmail armor, as well as Vendel 11. There's a vague indication that Vendel 3 contains chainmail fragments. We have Valsgärde 8 with a splint armor. Rickeby, probably largely unknown, with a small fragment of a probable splint armor, like the Valsgärde 8. And also a very peculiar female 8th century grave from Uppsala that was recently excavated a few years ago, where the female seems to be buried with a fairly large piece of a chainmail armor, and then what is otherwise a rich jewelry set. So this is a very peculiar thing. If we go to Vendel, in my opinion, this is perhaps the most interesting armor, but unfortunately the find conditions are very bad. In Vendel 10 has been completely plundered. You can see the outline of the boat where the rivets are placed, and in the center where the chamber part of the boat burial was, it's completely empty. due to the grave robbing. But in the filling of the grave during the excavation, they found large pieces of chainmail, and it's probably not the chainmail advisor from a helmet, but most likely from a chainmail armor. In Greta Arvidsson, when she published Valsgärde 8 in 1954, she also said that there are pieces of a splint armor related to this grave. I haven't found it in the records, in the archives, but I haven't seen the finds personally in a few years. So I don't know if it is splint armor in this grave. The other grave, Vendel 11, is also plundered. You can see that in the gray shaded area, there are no swords or no other big objects, but there are more fragments of the armor in this burial. We have in the uppermost part of you can see a half a shield that haven't been dug away. You see the rim of the shield. In the yellow area to the right is the location of the helmet, is fragments of the helmet, and in the center, what is largely the remains of a more or less complete chainmail armor. And in this burial, Stolpe and Arne also show a picture of chainmail with an attached plate. And there is probably a few plate fragments attached to the chainmail, but I am very uncertain about if it perhaps is a chainmail armor with attached plate to it, because we can't see any rivet holes that we can, for example, relate to medieval or later Asian armor where plates have been attached to the chainmail. So that is an open question. And I've also looked in the photographs in the Historical Museum records, and I can't really see these plates. So this is another case where we need to make more examinations if there is really a chainmail armor with attached plates. So coming to Valsgärde, and this is a place with much better find conditions compared to Vendel, largely because it is a site that is more or less intact before excavation. It has not been plundered, and there are not so much damages to the graves. We have 15 boat graves. The Vendel period ones from 560 to 710 AD are placed on 2 locations. The yellow area show 3 of them, Valsgärde 5, 6, and 7. In the red area, we have the location of Valsgärde 8, which is the focus of this presentation, more or less, because that's where we have the best documented body armor from this period. And it is peculiar that we have Valsgärde 8. It's based more or less on a deviant location in comparison with the other ones. Here you see an overview of the boat grave with an empty aft. The swords in the picture more or less indicate where the body was placed. And by the front of the deceased, you see, by the feet of the deceased, you see shields, the helmet, and kitchen equipment, etc. From the what is interesting with this burial is that the preservation conditions for wood are very good compared to the other boat burials. On the other hand, the animal remains are less preserved. The human remains are also poorly preserved, the human bones. And it's also a grave where the grave goods is not as rich as, for example, Valsgärde 6 and 7, where you have a number of more swords. You can have up to 5 swords in these, 3 shields, more animals, more glass beakers, etc. But it is still this grave that contained the body armor. But thanks to the better preservation of the wood, we can see that the helmet has been packed in a wooden container and placed upon a number of wooden bowls. In front of the shield, we have the location of the body armor, and it has been packed into a very large, what we call svepask in Swedish. I don't have the real name for it in English. Made in linden bark with a maple lid. On this, inside the vessel, we have 3 sets of the body armor, or actually limb armor, and they are fairly well preserved, and usually well preserved for being iron from Valsgärde, because preservation conditions for iron in Valsgärde is pretty bad in general. But maybe it was thanks to being packed in a wooden container that they have been fairly well preserved. On this picture, you see the splint armor for the arm protection. You see the iron ribs fastened together with leather bands, each connected to an iron buckle. To the right of the picture, you can see that there has been hand protection in chainmail. Whether it was a glove or not, difficult to say. I know Matt Bunker, who has made a reconstruction of this armor, has created it into a glove. To the left of the picture, you also see chainmail, but those actually belong to the leg armor. So, and the leg armor is in 2 sets for the left and right lower leg of the person. They are, of course, longer than the arm protection. You have 3 leather bands for each of them with 3 iron buckles. And to the left group of the left set of a leg protection, you don't see the chainmail, but that's a documentation issue. You see them belonging to, but you see them connected to the other set. So it means that both legs probably had some kind of foot protection. As the iron is unusually well preserved, we can also identify the ornamentation on the mounts. We have one kind of ornamentation in the shape of striated lines along the edges of the iron strips. We also have a deeper ornamentation. I guess it's made with a file or it's cut the chisel onto the iron bands. And as you can see, the leather straps are connected to the iron with iron rivets with copper alloy heads. We have not examined if they were tinned or gilded, but I would guess that all of them were tinned originally. I have already said that these are arms and leg protection, and that has been the widely accepted interpretation during the last at least 20 years by all of those who have discussed it more. But for a long time, in the publication in 1954 by Arvidsson, and for a long time after that, it was shown in an exhibition in Uppsala, it was interpreted as a full body armor. And this is perhaps difficult to understand today because there are a couple of logical or factual circumstances that makes this reconstruction impossible. So, but I don't know if it still circulates around a little bit. And I think the reason why it was made like this by Greta Andersson was probably that she was heavily influenced by the depiction of a cataphract on the Dura Europos graffiti. I think that was the main influence for her. Main question is this an Eastern influence, like we have the current discussion about the armor, the lamellar armor from Birka? Is it an old influence from the East, from Byzantine, from Rome that had influenced it, or is it some kind of local origin for it that has been modified from some old influences? I personally have no real opinion or agenda. It is very tempting to, for example, relate it to Khazar armor. In that case, we have a chronological problem because I think most of these analogies are Viking age, so they are 150, 200 years earlier. But however you turn the arguments around, I think you land in the East anyway. Another question is is it a local production or an import? I think when you look at the technology of the armor and compare it with the other objects in the boat burials, in my opinion, it is locally or regionally produced. Not the least because on how you see how the riveting is made, how the ornaments are made. And perhaps it's not a coincidence that this kind of armor turned up as locally produced in the Wendel period, because when we read in the migration period, we don't see a lot of iron in the graves or in the society, at least in comparison with the Wendel period. So when we reach into the late 6th, 7th century, it seems like people in Middle Sweden and Gotland and other areas are having very fun with producing a lot of iron. You see the iron cauldrons. They are experimental and very enthusiastic in making chains and helmets and other things, iron spiral decorations on the Great Hall in Gamla Uppsala. So we see it is a very dynamic period when it comes to iron production and producing a lot of iron in different shapes. Future research. As far as I know, there has been a lot of people working with reconstructions of the Valsgärde armor and helmets and so on. So there has been a lot of discussion on the construction of these objects. But there has not been a lot of scholarly research and scientific research on neither the helmets nor the armor since the 1940s. That was when the last reconstructions of the helmet from Valsgärde and Wendel was made. So that's more than 80 years ago. And as far as I know, there has not been any major or any detailed reconstructions or studies of the Wendel chainmail armors. So there's a very high potential in finding new stuff and producing new results on these objects. X-ray investigations will produce very nice results. We know very little about the metallurgy. A lot of organic materials are attached to the objects that haven't been heavily conservated. So, and that goes for textiles and organic remains. We know there are fur remains on the iron. Perhaps we can find remains of clothing and the wrapping around the object as they were packed in the graves. And it can also be interesting to study the containers that held these different items. Finally, I think there is a lot of potential in my opinion, at least, it's very interesting to study where the armor, both the body armor and the helmets, were deposited in the graves. Charlotte Henestjärna Jonsson and I produced an article this year about the horse equipment in the boat burials. And we found that there are different ways of depositing the horse equipment in Wendel in comparison with Valsgärde. Because in Valsgärde, especially the pulling equipment for horses are placed by the bodies of the horses, the bridles are in the mouth and so on. While in Wendel, they seem to be deposited as separate depositions inside the boat. Something that struck me when a few days ago was that in Wendel, we have in Wendel 11, the helmet is lying right next to the chainmail. So it seems to be about where the cranium of the deceased was placed. And the same goes for Wendel 14, where the helmet is also placed by the head of the dead. In Valsgärde, the situation is different on all the boat burials because it seems to be deposited by the feet of the dead. And in the Valsgärde 8 case, we also see the body armor placed by the helmet. So it seems to be a pattern that maybe the deceased in Wendel is equipped with the armor when the person is lying in the grave, while the persons in Valsgärde are more equipped for traveling in some way. So that is then the armor of the graves helps us tell something about maybe different family traditions, on different boat burial sites. So this seemed to be a pattern that goes again that we can follow for generation of generation in the tradition of depositing certain items in the graves. So that was a quick and brief presentation about the body armor of these sites. Thank you.